Hey, good to be with you guys again. Hope everybody's doing well. And hopefully, as things start to get back to normal or whatever the new normal will be, that you guys are as excited as I am to launch into this new phase or this new season. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is during this time where we haven't been able to see each other, we've had to distance or isolate or whatever, the question that we've been asking is, what is God doing in us? So that what is God preparing to do through us? And so I want to explore kind of that idea a little bit more today in looking at as things start to open back up, as we start to get access to the barracks, as we start to meet together with chapel services and Bible study, that how can we take advantage of this time and how can we continue the momentum of what God has been doing through us and with our community during the last several months. So I kind of want to share a perspective that is something that God's showed me in my quiet time and I've kind of been meditating on for the last month, but share a little bit of a perspective of what we're thinking about going down the road. So there's all kinds of different compare and contrast in the Bible. John likes to talk about those and flesh those out, but one that stuck out to me was I want to compare two different kings in the Bible today and then talk a little bit about Jesus' perspective. So we want to talk about Saul and David today. And I don't have time to cover all the verses and all the different things that contrast. And I know that you guys are probably familiar with the stories of Saul and David. But I just want to flesh out a couple of different verses. And we have a lot to cover. So I'll give the verses. Hopefully the verses will speak for themselves. And I encourage you guys to take notes or write this down, look at the verses, and really try to figure out the difference. But as I'm talking, one of the things I want you guys to think about is as we're sharing these stories and these verses, what are these guys thinking? What is their motivation, and what are they trying to go after? And then we'll look at Jesus. So 2 kings, right? In 1 Samuel 8 is when Israel first demands for a king. And Samuel gets upset, tells them that they're rejecting God, but they insist, no, we want to have a king. So Samuel goes and anoints Saul. So I'm going to compare the two of these, so we'll jump around a little bit, but the verses will be on your screen, and again, take notes if that'll help. So 1 Samuel 10, verses 1 says, Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. And this shall be the sign for you that the Lord has anointed you to be prince over his heritage. So when Samuel anoints Saul, the purpose of him being king was so that he could continue to advance God's kingdom, continue to expand the promised land by attacking Israel's enemies and by being faithful with what God has promised the people of Israel up until this point. So now let's look at David. In 1 Samuel 16:13, it says, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. So when Samuel anoints David, it's for the same purpose. So both of these people were made king so that they could expand what God had promised to Israel. But how did this work out for both of them? Well, you already know how it worked out, but let's look at a couple of different contrasts. So in 1 Samuel 13, Saul has only been king for 2 years, and this is 3 years after he was anointed. So 3 years later, he is going to attack some Philistines or going to attack someone, and Samuel told him to wait until he was there to make the sacrifice. But 1 Samuel 13:8 says, He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. Some versions say, and the people's heart were melting. So what we see is that the people were afraid, which is a normal reaction to going into battle. Saul was doing what he was supposed to do to go and attack the enemies of Israel, but because they were waiting so long for Samuel, that the people's hearts were starting to melt. They were starting to be afraid. So Saul took it upon himself to sacrifice instead of Samuel so that the people would not run away from Saul. So Saul's concern was his own status and image in front of the people, that he did not want the people to run away from him. He did not want, or he wanted the people to continue to look to him as their king, look to him as their leader. And so he took it upon himself to make this sacrifice that God did not want him to do. And what was the consequence? When Samuel shows up, he tells Saul that the kingdom is going to be taken from him and given to someone else in a different family. So now let's contrast that with David. Again, two kings in similar circumstances with two very different responses. In 1 Samuel 17, we see David and Goliath. And I'm sure all of us know the story from Sunday school, but I want to look at verse 26 and 32. 1 Samuel 17, 26 and 32. And David said to the men who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away this reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And David said to Saul, in verse 32, and David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistines." So there's two things that David recognized. One is that this was not a personal attack against David. Goliath was not challenging David. Goliath was challenging God. Just like the people being afraid was not an indictment of Saul, but a consequence of they're just afraid to go into battle. So David did not want the people's heart to melt. He did not want the people's heart to fail. So he was willing to fight Goliath instead of taking it as that was a personal slight against himself. So what we see here is that Saul sacrificed all these sheep and these goats to preserve his status among the people. David was willing to sacrifice himself to preserve God's status among the people. Then shortly after that, we don't know how much time, but 1 Samuel 20, Saul is trying to kill David, and Jonathan helps out David escape. So this is a conversation between Jonathan and Saul. In 1 Samuel 20, verses 30 through 32, "Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said to him, 'You son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die.'" So you see that, again, Saul's concern is for his kingdom and his status. And he says, since you are helping David, then your kingdom is not going to be secure. So Saul is, at this point, no longer worried about trying to accomplish God's promises or trying to advance God's kingdom, but he's worried about preserving his own kingdom to pass on to his son Jonathan. And this is played out again, where after David runs away, he comes to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech helps him out, and then David leaves. Saul hears about this, and he goes to the priest, and then this is the conversation with the priest. In 1 Samuel 22, verses 13. "And Saul said to him, 'Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait, as at this day?'" So David just went to him to get some food, to get a sword, to make preparations, and he left. But Saul's accusation is that Ahimelech is trying to equip David to take the kingdom from Saul. And the consequence is Saul ends up killing him and his whole family. And I think it was 40 other priests. So Saul is trying to preserve himself, his legacy, his status, and his kingdom. But what is David's response? So mind you, at this point, David is not even king. So in a way, David has no responsibility for the kingdom. But what is David's response in this? As soon as he gets the supplies from Ahimelech, in 1 Samuel 23, verses 1 through 2, "Now they told David, 'Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floor. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, Shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah.'" So David leaves the priest, and he immediately goes and attacks the Philistines. So David is still trying to expand the kingdom of Israel and claim the promised land that God had given them. And David had no responsibility to do this at this point. So David's focus is clearly on the promises of God and the promise that God had given the land of Israel to them, where Saul is trying to kill David because Saul is trying to preserve his own kingdom. Now there's a verse many years later that talks about David in 2 Samuel, and I think that this highlights really the perspective that I think hopefully all of us can come to and settle on. It is 2 Samuel 5 verses 12. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So David knew that he was king, not for himself, but for God's people and for God's kingdom. And that is what David carried David into doing the things that he did. And so I think that's one of the reasons that he is called a man after God's own heart, is because on his mind was God's people and God's kingdom, not himself and his status. Another verse that illustrates this is at the very end of David's life. So this wasn't something David did when he was young and until he was king. Once he became king, he still was concerned about the people of Israel, unlike Saul. And this is very evident in 1 Chronicles 22. David sets his mind to build a temple for God, and then Nathan the prophet comes back to him and says, "Hey, you're not the one that's going to build a temple, but your son is going to." So David had every right at this point to just be happy and be content and say, "Okay, cool, my son's going to build a temple." But what does David do? He makes preparations for the workers. He gathers stone. He gathers wood. He gathers all the preparations for this. Even knowing he's not going to be the one to do it, he makes all of the preparations so that someone else can do it, so that someone else can still carry on the work of God, even if it's not him. So he's, again, not trying to cement his own legacy and his own kingdom, but he's continuing to try to advance the name of God for God's people and God's kingdom. So now let's take a step back and look at Jesus' perspective. So I think that, again, we said David is a man after God's own heart. So let's look at what God's heart is. In Luke 17:33, Jesus said, "Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it." So we see that Saul was constantly trying to preserve his own life, preserve his own status, preserve his own name, preserve his own kingdom. But Jesus says, whoever tries to do that, they're going to end up losing it. Why? Because if God is Lord, then it is no longer about me. And God is not going to share his glory with anyone. So the question is, am I living my life for myself or for advancing God's kingdom like David? In Mark 10:45, Jesus said, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." Again, to contrast David and Saul with the sacrifices, Saul sacrificed a bunch of sheep and goats in order to preserve his status among the people as their leader. David was willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of God and the people. And in John 5:19, Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, the Son of Man can do nothing on his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise." So Jesus' perspective was, I can only do what I see the Father doing. And I think that's the perspective that I want to challenge all of us with moving into this new phase where everything starts to open up is, are we doing only what we see the Father doing in order to advance his kingdom? So can we take the same perspective that David had, that David knew that he had been appointed king for his people, for God's people and for God's kingdom. So what if the thought that we can take is, I am in this MOS for God's people and God's kingdom. I am in the 82nd for God's kingdom and God's people. I'm in this unit for his people and his kingdom. Like, what if we had that thought process and that perspective as we launch into this new phase? Everything opens up. Now we can re-engage. Now we can continue to build God's kingdom. So are we trying to build our own kingdom, or are we trying to build God's? A challenge that I always ask myself is, am I trying to make disciples of myself, or am I trying to make disciples of God? So God anointed both kings to advance his kingdom and his promises, but only one of them actually maintained that perspective throughout their entire life, that it was about God, not about themselves. So I'll leave you lastly with a quote from Robert Coleman with the Master Plan of Evangelism. In the first chapter he says, "Jesus was not trying to impress the crowd, but to usher in a kingdom." So what if we have that perspective going in? What has God done in us during this time of isolation? What is God preparing to do through us so that we can usher in his kingdom and not try to build our own? So I'm excited to see how this plays out as we can re-engage with guys and how we can continue to advance his kingdom and the perspective that God has appointed us in the various different places that we're at for his kingdom and his people. So I appreciate you guys letting me share, and I look forward to continuing to laboring with you guys again in person. Thank you.